If the bearing comes out easily, you need a new bearing housing. Obviously, these are two brothers that trust each other and have been doing this for a long time. It's driven in all the way, so the bearing is now setting on the upper snap ring. Now they're going to lay it over and put in the lower bearing. That lower bearing goes on a tapered bearing adapter. That tapered bearing adapter is then pulled up tight, and by doing that it locks the lower bearing in place. A couple things that are very important on the lower bearing, which we'll look at as we get into it. If you're rebuilding the sifter, to get the lower bearing out, you have to first remove the entire upper spindle, take out the snap rings, the filler ring, and then drive it out. And then putting it back together, you don't want to drive the lower bearing in all the way. You check to make sure which side the taper is so you don't put the bearing in backwards. Put your adapter in, and we'll grease it. And we're going to start to tap it in, make sure we get it started squarely. Okay. Then we're going to lay the wheel down. We're going to take two drift pins. And with these drift pins, we're going to start to drive the bearing in place. We don't want to drive the bearing down past the first snap ring groove. Okay, what DJ is doing is starting to drive the bearing in. Then the most critical part here is we're going to put the snap ring in place so that when the bearing is driven in, as soon as the snap ring reaches the snap ring groove, it snaps in place. Once the snap ring snaps in place, they make sure that it rotates. Now that bearing can be driven in another 1/8 of an inch. But if you drive it in another 1/8 of an inch, when you turn that wheel right side up, the bearing will not be sitting on the snap ring. By doing it this way, we have the bearing top and bottom both sitting 100% on the snap ring when the sifter is in the upright operating position. This allows the bearings to float, which is very important for keeping the bearings running cool. And we have had bearings in bakeries last up to 40 years. What we're going to do now is tighten the bearing adapter. And the first thing we do is make sure the bearing adapter is pulled up all the way. It can be tightened with a drift pin driving it around. We've made a special tool which just allows us to use the impact gun and then fellas, show them how you do it if you did it with a drift pin. If you do it with a drift pin, you would simply put the drift pin into a hole and drive it until it's tight, then bend a notch over to lock it in place. Now you'll notice when you do this that the upper spindle becomes very difficult to move. You may have to move it just a little bit to line it up. And then by bending one of the dogs down, it'll lock it in place. Then what we're going to do is hit it with a 4x4, and what that'll do is free up the upper spindle. And it'll spin freely and perfectly uniformly. Now we're going to put in about a tube and a half of grease, and we'll turn the camera off so we don't bore you with details while we fill this up with grease. And what we've done is we've greased it until the grease is coming right through the lower bearing. That means the upper bearing and the lower bearing have been literally pressurized 100% full of grease. Now we're going to set this aside and we're going to start on the lower wheel. So we're going to bring the spider base into the middle. I would be using the forklift, but the boys will pick it up and move it. We set it on a couple of 4x4s. That simply gives us ground clearance. Now we're going to take the lower spindle and we're going to put it We're going to take the lower spindle and bolt that in place. That goes onto a machine surface in the spider base. It's simply a drop-in fit. While they're tightening up the bolts, should you be rebuilding this sifter, you would simply reverse the process. On the upper spindle, what you would do is loosen the bearing collar, the bearing adapter, and after you back it off 2 or 3 turns, Tim, take the hammer and show them where they'd hit the bearing adapter. After you back it off, the bearing adapter in the upper wheel, what you do is back off the bearing adapter, and then you would hit it. Don't hit it. Just show them where you'd hit it.
Where would you hit it?
Right on the edge.
Right on the edge?
Yeah. And what that does is unseats the bearing adapter. Then we take a brass rod and drive the upper spindle completely out. And driving the upper spindle completely out will then allow you to take out the snap rings from the opposite side and drive the lower bearing out. You have to make sure all the snap rings are taken out before you do this.